Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, countries collectively are the US's fourth largest trading partner, and together represent a market with a GDP of more than $2.9 trillion. However, this formerly robust relationship currently faces many challenges, ranging from those related to the COVID pandemic, an erosion of confidence in the US as a strategic partner and provider of regional security, and declining American influence as a result of deglobalization policies of the previous administration. We are fortunate to have with us today two top experts to lead this briefing. These experts in U.S. Southeast Asia relations and trade and economics will provide an overview of the current state and future trajectory of trade between the United States and these countries. And what we hope to do is to provide information on how the U.S. can work with the region and these specific nations to further economic growth, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic and economic recovery following that. So first, I'd like to welcome John Goyer. John is the Executive Director of Southeast Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Previously, he served as Vice President of Coalition of Service Industries and Senior Director of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. I'd also like to welcome Wendy Cutler. Wendy is Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute, ASPI, and the Managing Director of the Washington, D.C. office of ASPI. Prior to working at ASPI, Wendy spent nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she also served as acting deputy U.S. TR. During her USTR career, she worked on a range of bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade negotiations and initiatives, including the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S.-China negotiations, the WTO Financial Services negotiations, and APEC. You can read more about John and Wendy's bios in the attached program. But let's move on to today's briefing, and right after our discussion and some questions that I will ask John and Wendy, we will reserve the final 15 minutes for audience question and answer discussion. And with that, let me launch into my first set of questions, which is going to focus on some specific countries before we move into more of a regional view. So let's talk a little bit about some key countries in the region, namely the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And John, let me start with you on the Philippines. You wrote a while back when the Trump administration was focused at one point in negotiating a free trade agreement with the Philippines. It had selected the Philippines as, I think, what it had envisioned as the first among several FTAs that it wanted to negotiate among Indo-Pacific countries. So there was some early momentum in the idea of a U.S.-Philippine relationship. The Philippines was a very willing partner, and some early discussions got off the ground. That stalled out, and as I understand it, there are not current ongoing discussions on a bilateral trade agreement. Again, as I understand it, but perhaps you know more, largely due to concerns in Congress around President Duterte's human rights record. So the idea of having a free trade agreement with the Philippines at a time when their human rights record under President Duterte's war on drugs was not very palatable. But if we were to think about a bilateral trade agreement with the Philippines, I mean, what is appealing from a commercial standpoint in that kind of arrangement? What would you see as appealing, and how would you go about thinking about structuring a bilateral FTA? Are there things in a bilateral FTA with the Philippines that would be mutually beneficial?
Well, thanks for the question, Amy. Appreciate it very much. I also want to thank the U.S. Asia Institute for having me. I have had the opportunity to participate in their events in the past, and they are always excellent. So I thank them for that. You know, Amy, I think to take the last piece of that question, I think first and foremost, we need to think about enhancing our economic engagement in the region through a variety of means, and whether that's bilateral deals or plurilateral like the CPTPP, or sectoral agreements in specific areas. Some action is better than no action here. You are correct that there had been a sort of low-key conversation with the Philippines over the course of a couple of years during the previous administration about having a bilateral FTA, presumably modeled on, some of the existing ones with whatever tweaks needed to be made. But there was concern about this, certainly in the Congress and elsewhere. And so the conversation really, unfortunately, didn't go anywhere. Now, the Philippines will have a leadership change in the next year or so. Does that present an opportunity for restarting the conversation? I think it might, and I think we should. The Philippines had been interested in the TPP under President Aquino. And in fact, we did an analysis with USAID a couple of years back looking at the text of the TPP, of the then TPP, and compared it against existing Philippine trade and investment law. And while there certainly would have been reforms needed in order for Manila to join the TPP, it was not, in our view, it was by no means out of reach. I think they were and could be a serious candidate to join either a pact like that or a bilateral agreement with the United States. I'm not aware of any conversations taking place at this point. I think that USTR designate Thai has been kind of non-committal about the future of both in progress bilaterals such as with the UK and Kenya, and we're not hearing a lot about other potential full-blown bilateral deals in the region, but it is early days, so we'll be watching that space closely.
Thanks, John. We will talk about CPTPP and other regional, other approaches to trade as well. But Wendy, let me turn to you on Vietnam. Vietnam in some ways has emerged as a close trading partner. The Obama administration had included Vietnam under TPP, which you negotiated, which was a real milestone until the United States backed away from TPP. So unlike some other countries in TPP, like Singapore and Australia, New Zealand, where the United States has FTAs already with these countries, there's not an existing free trade agreement with Vietnam. So backing away from TPP, created this situation, this awkward situation. And yet, Vietnam is a growing economy with a lot of young consumers, growing market, young consumers that like to buy American goods. I was surprised to learn recently that Vietnam is the 6th largest market for American agricultural products, the 7th largest market if the EU is considered one single market. But very large market for American agricultural goods and presumably other American goods. But taking agricultural goods for a moment, now that Vietnam is in CPTPP, which has Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and now has a FTA with the EU, is a member of RCEP, with other agricultural producing countries. American agricultural producers are really going to start to get squeezed in this market at a time when they're seeing real potential in this market. So in other words, a market that has a lot of potential for American producers in agricultural and other industries, but some frustrations as well, irritants and competitors. So what is there opportunity to discuss, to really work on a bilateral framework with Vietnam, and what would be the most important sectors or issues to target in your view?
Well, thanks, Amy, and it's a real honor to be on this panel. Vietnam, I think before I answer that question, I think we should just take a step back and talk about Biden's trade policy a bit, because the president has made it clear that negotiating new trade deals are just not a priority and are not going to happen until domestic measures are taken, including COVID recovery, economic recovery, and competitiveness measures. So I think, that should be put in the context of our discussion today. And so in my mind, it's less about should we be doing bilateral FTAs with these countries, and more about what can we do with these countries, given that we're not ready to do a comprehensive trade agreement at a time when you couldn't be more correct. Other countries are more than willing to be doing them, and they are doing them, and we are on the outside looking in. When I look at Vietnam in particular, I'm concerned going forward, because let's remember, at the last days of the Trump administration, they had a Section 301 investigation going on with respect not only to currency manipulation by Vietnam, but also with respect to their timber practices. And my understanding is both of these investigations they're still open. And so hopefully, in my mind, I would hope that the Biden administration, if indeed they agree that these practices are of concern, that they'll work quietly and constructively with Vietnam to find a landing zone on these issues and an accommodation versus going ahead and imposing tariffs. But I don't think that story is over yet. I'm hoping it is, but this is one of those kind of issues that are in the inbox of Catherine Tai, who hopefully will be taking the helms of USTR later this week. But I think, there's a lot we can be doing with Vietnam in the economic space. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of, economic potential. Vietnam is a young population, a growing country. They're one of the few countries that registered positive growth in 2020, along with China and Taiwan. They're raring to go, and a lot's going on in that market. So I would hope that the U.S. will find a way to be engaged not only in Vietnam, but in the region, and not wait to figure out if a full-fledged FTA could happen.
Thanks, Wendy. Let's the other country I did want to just talk about before we move to the Biden administration priorities and thoughts about regional arrangements is Indonesia. Indonesia is the big country in the region. Many predict it to be one of the largest countries, perhaps the third largest country in terms of its market by the end of the decade. So very large growing market, but very difficult market as well. A lot of bureaucratic red tape, a lot of trade restrictions, a lot of just difficulties, working to liberalize the market in many ways. It's also recognized as a really important strategic partner for the United States. Again, it comes with a lot of difficulties in really implementing real concrete initiatives to really step up our relationship. So there has been efforts to boost our economic ties. The Indonesians have passed a big omnibus bill last November that is supposed to take on a lot of economic reforms, including reforms the United States has long asked for. A lot of how that's really going to play out is in implementing legislation that now has to be interpreted by line ministries. And so the United States, the USTR and other agencies are going to be working closely with the line ministries as they are putting, legislation and regulations in place to try to work out some of these irritants. But to really both of you, how do you view Indonesia? What are the key areas that hold real potential for our trade relationship? And whether it's in the guise of a bilateral agreement, a set of discussions, or a broader regional or multilateral set of discussions, how should we be approaching this country, recognizing the huge economic potential, the huge strategic potential, and yet the real difficulty of moving the ball forward on the ground, both in kind of getting meaningful economic reform done on the ground and really moving our relationship to a more strategic and closer, to a kind of a closer strategic level. John, can I start with you?
Sure, sure. And I'll let me just preface this by wholeheartedly endorsing Wendy's previous set of comments. I suspect that I'm going to be agreeing with pretty much everything she says today. But, you know, Indonesia, when I think of the bilateral economic relationship, the word underperforming comes to mind. And it has consistently been that way. Trade, investment ties are nowhere near where they should be, given the size of our two economies. For example, the United States exports more to Peru than it does to Indonesia. It sells more to the Dominican Republic than it does to Indonesia. I mean, that just makes no sense to me. You know, the official Commerce Department data show that there's about $12 billion of US investment in Indonesia. And it shows that there's a total of 338 billion in ASEAN as a whole. So what's going on here? Granted, on the investment side, some of that's channeled through Singapore, so it's a little bit deceptive. But I think it's still clear that the investment is again falling far short of its potential. We have had a number of longstanding market access concerns in Indonesia. Some of which seem to have been addressed in the context of the omnibus law that you mentioned, Amy, as well as the GSP review, where there were a number of particular issues of concern for us that we think have been taken care of. So I think that between those reforms and the Omni, I think it's going to be helpful, but it doesn't mean that the challenges in Indonesia, which are more structural and in a sense deeply embedded, are going to go away. And sometimes the messaging that comes out of Jakarta can be unhelpful. You probably saw the press coverage the other day where President Jokowi was quoted as saying, we have to learn to hate foreign products. Then the government issued a correction that he was referring to, products that have been dumped. Regardless, that statement did not go unnoticed. And so, we have to look at, on the one hand, there is a push to open the economy, and on the other hand, there's resistance to that same push.
Wendy, do you have any?
Yeah, if I can add, John did refer to kind of the quiet deal that was reached between USTR and Indonesia at the end of the Trump term, whereby in exchange for staying inside the GSP program, Indonesia did take some important steps to resolve some bilateral irritants. So that leaves me somewhat hopeful. If we've been able to clear some of this underbrush, maybe going forward, we'll be able to find ways to strengthen our relationship. I think one area where we can look to work together is in the whole area of supply chains. And I know Indonesia is trying hard to attract some of the production that either is leaving China or as companies seek to diversify, not, China plus one type of strategy. Indonesia is trying to get in that mix. And I think that's an area where if we can work with Indonesia and somehow with respect to essential and strategic products, build some trusted and secure supply chains with them, I think it's an area worth exploring going forward, along with digital trade, where Indonesia has been somewhat protectionist, has put in some restrictions. I think we're still investigating them under 301 with respect to their digital services tax. So I think, I think there are some concrete areas where we either can work with them bilaterally or as part of a regional initiative. And I would hope that given the importance that this administration is attaching, not only to the Indo-Pacific region, but to ASEAN countries in particular, I would hope that these are areas where we can make some progress on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Wendy, you brought up supply chains. Let me jump into supply chains. The Biden administration has launched a supply chain, task force to really kind of take a look in the wake of COVID-19 and the concerns that it has surfaced over supply chain resilience and, not being too dependent on China for supply chain vulnerability, among other things. And many other countries are concerned about this as well. At the same time, in the midst of the U.S.-China trade war or trade spat, the kind of trade conflict that emerged in the previous administration, many Southeast Asian nations, as you mentioned, Wendy, were the beneficiaries to some degree of some of the multinationals looking to diversify some of their supply chains outside of China, so both because of disruptions related to COVID and because of disruptions related to the tariff wars launched by the Trump administration. So, John, let me turn to you and ask you about how you see the different countries in Southeast Asia. Were there clear winners and perhaps losers in the previous years as multinationals have made decisions related to supply chain management? And what are lessons learned about how countries can best attract investment related to supply chains? Or is this going to be, are there going to be different lessons to be learned in the coming years? Are things going to get back to normal, so to speak, and multinational investment is it going to be redirected back to more familiar patterns, or is it going to continue to be shifting in ways that countries will have to be trying to take advantage of in novel and new ways?
Yeah, well, so I think there's a couple parts to that. Investment had already been migrating to some degree out of China prior to the trade war as a result of increased costs and a number of factors, and it was looking for new homes in Southeast Asia. I don't know that there's any real clear winners in Southeast Asia from the whole trade conflict. Vietnam seems to have garnered the lion's share of investment that did migrate out of China. But one of the interesting things that we've seen is that, we did kind of a thumb analysis on this recently, looking at the tariff differentials as a result of the trade war. And so averaging out, comparing the goods that Southeast Asian nations export to the United States against those same HS categories exported from China, where tariffs of 25% or other levels were applied, what was the average tariff differential? And so we came up with a figure of about as high as 19% for the Philippines and as low as 12% for Vietnam. So the Philippines had an average 17% tariff differential. So in principle, you would think that it would have captured a lot of that export activity. And its exports to the United States have increased during the course of the US-China trade conflict, but so have exports from everybody else, except Indonesia, actually, where they've been kind of flat. Thailand had a tariff advantage of about 14%, Malaysia a little less, Indonesia was on the order of 14%. And so it's interesting that most of those countries were able to take advantage and increase their exports. But does that mean that that was because of those tariff differentials? Because all of these countries have been growing their exports to the United States for years anyway. So how much was this a factor? And, you don't know. And the results, the economic slowdown from COVID obviously obscures those results too. What would growth have been? And you can't prove the counterfactual, so it's difficult. I think the data are kind of interesting to look at. And I think that the question that countries in Southeast Asia need to look at, and they are, is, holistically, if there is going to be a fairly major shift in regional supply chains with a lot of production activity leaving China, what do Southeast Asian countries need to do to attract it? And Thailand is not going to need to do the same things as Indonesia or Malaysia as Vietnam. All of those countries came into this trade conflict at different levels of development. different capacities, different productivity levels, composition of the workforce, et cetera. But I think that they are and will need to continue to determine the right policy mix in order to maximize the advantage that their countries may have resulting from the conflict.
Mhm. Okay, let's shift to views in the region of the United States and kind of U.S. leadership. Several polls, the recent State of Southeast Asia survey that is done by the ISEAS think tank in Singapore, for example, has shown, CSIS did a survey of Southeast Asian elites as well for late 2019. They all show very similar results, which is that, Southeast Asians definitely see a decline in U.S. presence, the sort of decline of trust in the strategic presence and engagement of the United States, at the same time that they see China's economic power as very much on the rise, or really they see China as the dominant player in the region. Even though they don't really trust China, they certainly see China's economic preeminence as already a fact in the region that they have to deal with. So there's been this erosion of trust that the United States is a real reliable strategic partner that shows up in all of these surveys over the past year or two. So how can the United States, and a big part of that, it's pretty clear, is that the United States is just seen as absent on the economic side. The United States has walked away from TPP or CPTPP at a time when China, and the United States has not been a big investor in major infrastructure projects at a time when China has been stepping forward, and China, as well as other countries, Japan and others, has been a big player in big infrastructure with, Belt and Road and other kinds of initiatives. So here we are with a new administration. What, and as Wendy and John, you've already both acknowledged, there still is a lot of concern domestically about big, bold trade, negotiations, a big trade policy. Although I would note that in public opinion polls of Americans, the support for globalization and trade agreements is actually pretty high. I'm not sure it's ever been higher in many of the polls that you look at. So it's certainly a political problem in terms of the way the way the two major political parties are currently positioned on trade policy. But it's not necessarily a political problem in terms of the majority opinion of Americans, but that's, that's an interesting political science topic, which we can delve into or not. But in any case, so where are we? What can, how much space does the Biden administration have? I think it's pretty easy to say, and the Biden administration team has said it, that, they have to get our own house in order first. They have to deal with COVID relief. They have to deal with a number of things before they can get very ambitious on the trade agenda. But at some point, the trade agenda is staring at them. And if they want to get serious about an Indo-Pacific strategy, a strategy of dealing with China on democracy and a whole host of other issues, they're going to have to face this, because it's very clear that you can't have a real China strategy, a real Indo-Pacific strategy without an economic strategy. So what would that look like? What do you think the region needs to hear? Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but pretty soon. What is the region going to need to hear to start to build back confidence that the United States has not completely walked away from the game? Wendy, let me start with you, and then John, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, sure, and I'd open it up and say the latest survey by ISEAS that you mentioned, it's interesting because there is kind of what's called a Biden boost in the responses this year, that kind of optimism about, U.S. engagement in Asia. So that was somewhat encouraging. But look,
Yeah,
we're going to
also
need.
that might set expectations that could, you know, there's a little bit of concern that it might set expectations.
Yeah, but I would argue, I don't think the numbers like flew off the charts, but they were going in the right direction. But yeah, but absolutely. But I thought, look, there's a real trust deficit, not only in the region, but globally. And so I think that the United States, we're going to need to rebuild the trust. And as you mentioned, we're not going to be going into these big trade agreements. So the question is, what can we do short of that? And in my view, we need to re-engage, and we need to re-engage soon. And I think there are things we can do. And, you know, everything from participating in the officials and leaders meetings and summits that are coming up in Asia. That's very important, as we all know, as working in the region for many years. Some of the meetings that we have been asked to go to and attend, Amy, on behalf of our government have been, let's just say, quite boring and not outcome driven. But all that said, we knew why we needed to be there. Showing up is really important. Participating is important. Putting ambassadors in place in all of these countries. I mean, in some of them, we didn't even have an ambassador for 4 years. And I think we never even filled the ASEAN ambassador position. So those are good steps to take, as well as inviting ASEAN officials here when travel can happen, or leaders, or maybe even doing like a leaders virtual meeting like Biden will be doing with the Quad countries soon is something that could be done. But at some point, I think you're right. Like we're going to need actions. We're going to need initiatives. And I think it would behoove us to also listen to what the Southeast Asian countries want. What are their concerns? Where are their priorities? And where do they think there are the strongest prospects for constructive work between us and them? You know, I mentioned supply chains as an area of work. Where we share some common interests and could move forward. I also think the whole area of digital trade is an area just ripe for a regional deal, in that there are a lot of individual bilateral deals. You have the CPTPP, where the e-commerce chapter was left basically intact with a few changes. And, you know, the US, through its deals with Japan and Canada and Mexico, has also entered into CPTPP plus agreements. So in short, I think digital is an area where we can work together, and not just on data, but also on making digital work for digital inclusiveness for our entire population, for small and medium-sized enterprises, and really helping to kind of turn around the economies, particularly in Southeast Asia, that do need a boost coming out of COVID as well. So I think, again, that's an area ripe for discussion. Also, the area of climate change is a top priority for this administration, and they're going to be looking to see how trade fits into that picture, as all agencies are asked, what are they doing in the climate space? So I think this is going to be a priority for the United States. And I would hope that the Southeast Asian countries, whether it be looking at further reducing tariffs for green technologies or for reining in subsidies on fossil fuels, I think there are things that we can do with Asia broadly and with Southeast Asia in particular.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, Wendy is absolutely right. Part of this is just showing up, and we haven't been showing up, and we need to. And there are many opportunities during the course of a given year for us to show up at the top level, at the cabinet level, engagements with the trade ministers from ASEAN and the ASEAN plus countries, with the finance ministers, energy ministers, and others. So I think robust participation in those forums is certainly going to be part of it. You know, on the survey that you mentioned, Amy, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that about 3/4 of the respondents to that survey see China as the undisputed economic power. And about 3/4 of the people that answered that way are also uncomfortable with that fact. About 90% see China as the political and strategic power. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, about half see China as the dominant political and strategic, but about 90% are really concerned about that fact. So you know, in part, I feel like from a public relations standpoint, China does a lot of work for us. I mean, it's almost like they're, you know, being trying to proactively undercut themselves, you know, wolf warrior diplomacy, bullying of countries in the region, using trade measures to punish certain governments for things that they say or don't say about China, and all of that. And of course, it's, you know, it flows back to some degree. You know, I think for the US, and you know, your question was more economic than strategic, but I think we need to avoid overt pressure on ASEAN countries to quote unquote take sides. There's so much conversation about the ASEANs don't want to take sides. Of course, that's true. So overt pressure to do so is unhelpful, but we do need to increase our economic engagement. I agree with Wendy on digital agreements as one way to do that. We've made proposals on enhancing our TIFA with Vietnam as another way to build toward something better. Under the auspices of our TIFAs, we could have discrete agreements in energy or customs or IP and other areas. So there's options to look at. And finally, to this question of perceptions, this wasn't covered in the ISIS survey that you mentioned, but US companies actually have positive approval ratings, certainly relative to their Asian competitors and even compared to European, other Western competitors. We've done survey work on this over the last few years, and the views have been pretty consistent. So US companies are viewed positively, and of course they are a positive force in the region. They are tightly wound into ASEAN supply chains, and we can get into some of the statistics of that if you want, but I think that they are seen as adding value to the economy. They hire locally, they procure, they source locally. There's R&D, there's workforce development, any number of these sorts of things, which all contribute to that positive image. So if the corporate side of America has a positive image, then how can we leverage that strength? How can we build on that in a way to advance our broader interests in the region? I think that's one of the questions I would have.
Yeah, that's a great. Oh,
I can just build on something that John said. In talking about China, I mean, I think you're spot on. I mean, these countries, they don't want to choose. Don't ask them the question. They don't want to answer. They're just learning how to navigate and get the best out of both. Right. And so I think a lesson that the United States can learn from that is that as we propose initiatives, we should do it in a smart and subtle way, and not in a way that's anti-China, right? More talking about the merits of the initiatives that we are putting forward. So in other words, digital trade isn't to, you know, digital trade is more about in narrowing the digital gap. It's more about promoting small, medium-sized enterprises. It's more about allowing the free flow of data, et cetera. In other words, a positive and constructive agenda, not describing these initiatives as anti-China or countering China's, you know, unfair practices. I think if we do that, our chance of success is much greater.
I completely agree. And even when I was in the Pentagon, it was so easy to get pulled into discussions about countering China's maritime assertiveness, but it was so much more productive and had so much more resonance in the region when we would do what we tried to do, which is talk about our support for an open, rules-based, inclusive, norms-based order. You know, this is language that the ASEAN countries and everyone in the region has long embraced. I mean, this is part of the ASEAN Charter and everything else. And it's really, you know, they're ways of saying the same thing, but you're talking about supporting, you know, norms that everyone can agree to, rather than putting it into a anti-China frame. So I'm glad you both brought up those points. Those were really excellent. Let me turn to some big regional trade agreements. Let's start with RCEP. Let me go to Wendy on this question first. So the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, this is the big, I forgot my math. How many countries are in it now, Wendy? Is it
15 without India.
15 without India. So these are all the countries in the East Asia Summit minus India, which dropped out, and not including the United States and Russia, but the ASEAN countries plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, signed and late last year So it's now being put into effect. And so a major accomplishment after 8 long years of negotiation. Many people, especially in Washington, predicted it would never come to pass. And if it did, it would never have any real impact. But to some people's surprise, it actually is a relatively meaningful agreement, I think. But we'll see how it plays out. So the United States is not in this agreement, obviously. What is it going to mean? Should the United States is outside of it? Are these countries now really, what does it mean both in economic, commercial terms, and then also political, strategic terms? Should the United States care that there is this big regional pact that it's not part of? What does it mean?
Well, first, just to clarify, the deal, while it has been signed, it hasn't come into effect yet. In order to come into effect, 6 of the 10 ASEAN countries need to ratify it. And I believe 3 of the dialogue partners need to. So people are expecting it will come into effect probably the first half of next year.
Okay.
Some people say maybe even the first quarter. When you look at RCEP, and as a trade negotiator, I have to say, the minute the text was released, I poured through the pages, and you can look through it, and it's very easy to conclude this is a light agreement with not a lot of very robust commitments. You see where it's like countries strive to do things. Countries have 10-year, 20-year transition periods to implement certain provisions. Certain chapters aren't even in there: labor, the environment, state-owned enterprises. And many chapters, the dispute settlement provisions don't even apply, so it's not really enforceable. So you could look at all of that and easily conclude, you know what, we don't need to be concerned. But my view is you are missing the boat if you come to that conclusion. And that is because it is a deal among 15 Asian countries that have not come together on trade before, and particularly in Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, and China, doing deals among themselves as part of the RCEP agreement. But more importantly, all RCEP countries now have agreed to what's called a common rule of origin, which basically means you can ship your products freely between the 15 countries and not have to come up with individual documentation and not have to count, the content of your product in different ways. And so from a trade facilitation point of view, this is going to be enormous benefit to the companies of the signatory countries of RCEP. And over time, supply chains are going to be built around this trade agreement. I also believe that, like ASEAN deals, this deal will be improved over time. So when new issues need to be taken up, this is going to be a ready-made group with lots of meetings at different levels, including ministers getting together. And this is going to be a logical venue to talk about developing standards and norms and rules in new areas. And the US, we're not at that table. We're not helping make those rules. And one thing I've learned in trade is once rules are made, countries then say, oh, that worked in RCEP, let's move that rule and see if we can make it work in a WTO negotiation. So, look, the US was never going to join RCEP. That deal, we would never get it through Congress. It's just not even, in our lane. But the fact that we left CPTPP, that deal's been in effect now for over 2 years among 7 countries. And now you have the RCEP deal moving in parallel. That's something the United States should be concerned about. And over time, if we don't figure out a way to re-engage, and even if we do it again in a step-by-step building block approach, that's better than nothing, as long as we can find ways to engage, to have impact, and be at this table helping to set the rules and not let others do it without us.
Thank you. Yeah, John, let me turn to you and ask about RCEP. What I want to ask is, does RCEP, now that it has crossed the finish line, not yet implemented, but clearly moving forward with the impact that Wendy's talked about, does it raise the stakes for the United States of not being part of other trade pacts, and in particular, not being part of CPTPP? So does it incentivize the business community to, really try to push the Biden administration and Congress to try to get back into CPTPP or launch something akin to it, or is there another, or are they relatively sanguine about it? Are there other solutions to deal with the growing competitive pressures, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope it has that result of mobilizing activity and interest and raising the pitch on the conversation about our trade posture in the region. I think, as Wendy said, RCEP does not contain a law that would inform U.S. trade policy making. I would not pass Trade Promotion Authority strictures. There are some tariff reductions, some services trade liberalization and things like that that are beneficial. So it's not insignificant. If you're a U.S. company, it really depends whether you're already invested in Asia or whether you're exporting from the United States. In the former case, you love it because it makes it easier to sell across the region with the common rules of origin that you referred to, maybe lower tariffs, other trade facilitation measures. So much of the American investment in Southeast Asia is already geared towards selling within the region anyway that RCEP will benefit them. Now, who doesn't benefit? The US-based exporters who face increased competitive pressure from competition within the region, whether it's both RCEP and CPTPP. Those exporters do not get the benefits of the agreement. American investors who have a presence in Asia do get the benefits of the agreement.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Wendy, let me, we're running out of time. I do want to turn the audience next, or turn to questions from the audience. But just to close out this discussion, you said that, I forget the word you used, but you said, doing larger trade agreements is off the table. And I want to push you on that. I mean, I was, in Catherine Tai's confirmation hearing, I was trying to find the word she used. When she was pressed on CPTPP, she did not put it off the table. She said something about it was actually I forget the word she used, but it was a good framework or
formula.
Formula.
Formula working with like-minded countries.
Yeah, a good formula or something like that. And she said times have changed. I mean, she was cautious. She clearly didn't, embrace it, as she clearly didn't signal that they were unquestionably going to go back to CPTPP, but she also did not run away from it. So, she certainly left it there as a possibility. And she's an interesting pick for Biden as the next U.S. trade representative. I mean, she's someone who, given her background as a former chief counsel on House Ways and Means, she certainly knows the Hill. She knows Trade Promotion Authority. She knows, presumably how to keep congressional stakeholders on board. So if there was an appetite to try to go in that direction, she would be the one, presumably, who would really kind of know what levers to pull and how to keep that balance. But maybe it's too heavy a lift. But I guess the question is, why would you say it's just completely off the table? Maybe you didn't say that, but why not? Why? It seems to me like, what else do we have? So you did point to a sectoral approach, and maybe that is what you're thinking, that's the best way forward, is to really go to start with a sectoral approach and build up. But if the region is really looking for signals that the United States is really looking to get back in the game in a serious way, I mean, why not signal that we're working to find a way back to something maybe renamed, maybe revised, but something that looks like, sort of smells like CPTPP?
So just to be clear, I'm talking about kind of how I'm reading the tea leaves, not where I stand personally, because I believe there's a lot of merit to us going back to the CPTPP, provided we could make some important updates and revisions. So I just say that. But look, I think Catherine, I listened closely to her comments there, and the way I took it was she sees merits in working with like-minded countries, But I think she was very clear that the objectives or the content of TPP, things have changed dramatically internationally, but more important, domestically. Second, there's no mention of renewing trade promotion authority. So if we were really interested in going back to one of these agreements, then I think the administration would be working on TPA, which expires in July. But that's going to take a lot of work. There's no mention of that. I think we're all expecting it to lapse because it's going to need some major work.
Okay.
Third, I don't even think if this administration tomorrow they said they wanted to join CPTPP, they would actually know what they would want in it and what they would want to take out of it. Okay, what they would want to add. So there's a lot of internal work that needs to be done. Many are looking at the USMCA as a model or perhaps a floor, but we're also hearing a lot about this new trade policy for workers, for the middle class, and that needs to be kind of translated into what that means for trade agreements. Because in my view, that doesn't mean just a robust chapter on worker rights and labor chapter. I think it means permeating many, many chapters, reviewing all of them to see how they benefit workers and the middle class, with the feeling that our deals to date have been too tilted towards corporate interests. So that's why I say that, and that's why I'm promoting doing kind of these narrower sectoral deals, because if it's all or nothing, I'm worried that we'll have nothing for a few years. And when we're ready to go back, I mean, if you think Asia has kind of figured out how to move on without us now, 3 years from now, it's going to even be a very different Asia. So I would hope we would find a way to get back in now, do it in smaller bites, rebuild trust, gain some momentum, get some impactful agreements under our belt, and hopefully during that time we become stronger domestically, which then would take pressure off our trade agreements to deliver things that they were never designed to do.
Okay, that's great. Very helpful. John, do you have any thoughts for what you would recommend first steps on a trade agenda would be for the Biden administration?
Sure. Well, I mean, I like to be ambitious, and I would like to think that there is some way to get back to the to the TPP, CPTPP, which is, 80, 90% US thought leadership. These are things, the rules that the United States had been pushing for, not what the other countries in it had been pushing for. So it seems to me that we've got a very good base to start on. We can look at this question. I don't know what the Biden administration means when it talks about, worker-centric trade agreements and so on and so forth. I don't know what that means exactly, but I hope that there will be an effort to define that so as to facilitate a conversation that is intended to find a way back into that agreement. We would support bilateral agreements with countries that are ready for it, some of which we've talked about it. That's certainly one way to go about it. It's interesting because historically speaking, that gets us back to this old debate of, it's so hard to do these trade agreements with individual countries because everyone has to go through Congress and it's so difficult. So let's do the TPP, we get them all in one big agreement, and then turns out that that's extremely difficult too. So it's kind of gone back and forth there. I think instead of dwelling on that as much, I think we need to identify some clear priorities in the region, some clear economic objectives, and whatever the mechanisms are to advance those, bilateral, multilateral, or sectoral, we should pursue them. But engagement in the region is key. We need to be there. We need to show up and be present. And I think that we can work with countries in Southeast Asia to find mutually beneficial agreements that will advance the economic interests of both sides.
Amy, if I can just add and just put a plug in for APEC. This is New Zealand's year for hosting, and right now they're in the midst of hosting, I think, their first senior officials meeting. They have, a very ambitious agenda planned on digital, on supply chains, on COVID relief, on women's empowerment and other issues, climate. And so I think this is an area where the United States can, almost without a beat, kind of get back in APEC in terms of working towards concrete outcomes, because that's where the host wants to be. And over the past 4 years, regrettably, APEC has had some important setbacks. And frankly, the US spent more time trying to get words out of the communiques and statements that were issued by APEC versus on working on concrete initiatives. So I think this is like a ready-made area where hopefully right now through these virtual meetings that New Zealand is hosting through this year, that we are helping shape important outcomes, because we've got a great partner with New Zealand this year.
Well, Wendy, I'm glad you put in APEC. I wanted to ask you a question. And we've run out of time, and I apologize that we didn't work in any audience questions. There weren't many from the audience, so but I've been a terrible moderator. I've used up all the time, and I also just want to make one final point. We weren't able to work in one final challenge when it comes to United States and Southeast Asia, and particularly the Biden administration, which is they want to really promote, put democracy promotion at the forefront of foreign policy, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And yet when it comes to Southeast Asia, these are countries that many of which have been backsliding on democracy, some quite severely. And so when we think about whether the right approach is bilateral or a regional kind of trade initiative, and getting it through Congress, I mean, putting democracy and human rights in the lens is going to further complicate that when you're thinking about countries like Vietnam or many of the other Philippines, many other countries in the region. Very few have a great democratic human rights record at the moment. So, and yet these are countries that are in our strategic long-term interests. They're longtime friends of the United States, have huge economic potential, and I certainly don't think we should turn our backs on them. So it's very tricky to figure out how to put all of this into one big strategic and economic package. So a lot of thought has to be done on all of these different pieces of the Biden agenda. But I'm glad we got to get your thoughts today. It was very helpful for me. I hope the audience enjoyed it. And let me turn it back to Alec for some final announcements.
Thank you, Amy. And do not worry, there was a lot to cover and you all did a great job. So we greatly appreciate you stepping in to moderate today. And, as mentioned, we know that it's especially hard to do in this format. So thank you there. Huge thank you as well to Wendy and John for joining us and providing your excellent insight. You guys all covered a lot today, and we certainly didn't have enough time to dive into everything. So hopefully this is just the beginning of the conversation as the U.S. and Southeast Asia work more closely together to develop deeper economic partnerships in the future. As I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of this briefing, we're just getting started with this series, and we'll continue to dive into specific issues and countries in the coming months. So please stay on the lookout for an invitation for the 5th briefing in this series. We are aiming to host our next session in this series the week of April 5th on maritime security issues. So to close out, I'd like to thank our corporate stakeholders again for their support: the Las Vegas Sands, Merck, Fairfield Maxwell, AIG, Airbnb, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, and Walmart. Again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day, everyone.